Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be doing a Eldar tier list covering the changes in the recent balanced data slate. So it's been a while since I've done a tier list. Figured I'd do it a little bit differently this time, just talk about the units with you guys and, do it kind of live. Also, the last time I did a tier list, the images were really small, really hard to see. So I'm hoping doing it this way through a live recording will fix that so you guys can actually see the units that I'm talking about on Tier Maker. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Now, there will probably be, this is my just live feedback, so there's probably going to be some errors along the way. Just keep that in mind. It's not pre-recorded or anything like that. So let's go ahead and dive right into it. Now, I'm kind of excited to do this because there's been a lot of changes to the Eldar index since the balanced data slate. Not only the nerfs, but also the change in the meta has really prompted us to reach deep into the index and, look at other units that might be effective. So the first unit that I want to talk about is probably a unit that, while in my mind still really good, is probably not meta right now, and that is Azurman. Now, Azurman is a unit that I really liked when Phantasm was good, because you could shoot with them with Dire Avengers on an objective, get that sweet Overwatch, and then fall back, and of course he allowed them to do it for free because of his special, rule. So hitting on 4+, Azurman is a good, has a good shooting profile. I think he has like 6 attacks, when he shoots at damage 2, strength 6 with a good AP. So he's really good. And of course, he makes Dire Avengers really good. Now, the problem with that unit is it's really expensive, and it required them to be safe from return fire. So Phantasm was a good way to do that. Unfortunately, because of the changes to Phantasm, you can't guarantee that they're going to be able to reach safety anymore. There's no ability to re-roll it. There's no ability to use a fate dice to guarantee that you get that. So unfortunately, Zerman's a little bit expensive for me. I probably would have put him in A tier before, but he's B tier for me now. And basically what that means is it doesn't mean he's bad. He's really good. He still has a really good combat profile. Still has, a 3+ invul, which is great when the Dire Avengers end up dying, because it allows him to live longer, and you could obviously use, more scarce resources to keep him alive. But he's just not going to give you that turn after turn value like he was before the balanced data slate with Dire Avengers. He's also not a Phoenix Lord you really want to run by himself because he has no way to revive himself, and he does have a 3+ invul, and maybe he's a better candidate for it, but again, he's not going to be hitting as hard as some of the other Phoenix Lords. And because of that, and because of his ability being, better with Dire Avenger units, I just don't think he's as strong as he was before. So that's where he's at. Obviously, though, I know some people still run him and have a lot of success with him, but I just don't think he's at that pinnacle of where I predicted him to be, because truthfully, I didn't expect Phantasm to get nerfed that badly. Okay, so let's go ahead and go on to the next unit, which is the Autarch. And this is the Autarch on foot. So the Autarch on foot, I think, is a solid option. I think it's even more solid considering we got some point increases in our army. And I have nothing bad to say about it. However, it's not as versatile as the Wayleaper, but it is much cheaper. So I think the Autarch on foot probably goes in A tier. It's definitely an A tier unit. I think that in some armies, you just want to probably just have a foot Autarch. If you just want to keep them in the back, you're not worried about indirect fire. You're not worried about any super fast units, killing them very easily. You can just have them in the back as a cheap command point, essentially regenerator. And he can be really good at that. So I believe it's only 75 points for an Autarch on foot, but it's either 75 or 85. I can't remember quite exactly, but it's very cheap, especially when compared with the Wayleaper. Now that I think about it, I think it is actually 75. So he's a really good bargain for that cost. And really, if you think about it, the only difference between him and the Wayleaper that really does matter is the movement, right? So the movement of the Wayleaper is obviously a really big, awesome thing. You can move really fast, but the Autarch on foot still is decently fast. You can score on secondaries and stuff like that. It's not a big deal. So yeah, A tier for sure. I think his ability is a little bit terrible, but The Way Leaper's ability isn't that great. It's helpful in some situations, but it's not amazing either. Okay, let's talk about the Autark Skyrunner. So it was recently brought to my attention after I thought they had fixed it, but I guess I was wrong, that the Autark Skyrunner can regenerate command points from reserve. Now, I don't believe you can use abilities from reserve. I think when you're in reserve, all abilities cease to function. However, I could be completely wrong on that. It doesn't specify in his datasheet that he has to be on the battlefield. So, for all intents and purposes, I think he can, just like Eldrad Uthran can, be in reserve and have your extra bonus fate dice, right? So what that means is, until of course they patch it, that means you can have him in reserve until, turn 3, and he can safely farm CP from reserve. Now, I think that's awesome, but the problem with the way Skyrunner, is that he just doesn't do anything else, right? You can give him a laser lance. He's an okay combat, he's okay in combat, but arguably speaking, he's worse than the Way Leaper just because he can't, have a Banshee Mask. He can't have Strike First. He can't have Manda Blasters or anything like that. So he does come with, obviously, the Jet Bike, which does give him an extra wound, an extra point of toughness. So that is nice, but it's just not great. I think he's probably sitting in B tier just because of his lack of options. I think if he had options, if you could give him a Banshee Mask, if you can give him a Manda Blaster or something like that, I think he'd be excellent. I think he'd be definitely an S tier unit, or at the very least, A tier. But, because you can't give him those extra options, you're stuck with the Laser Lance. The Dragon Fusion Gun option doesn't give him a melee profile as well. So I think GW really needs to go back and fix that. That's pretty sloppy not to do anything. I know it's an old kit and everything, but come on, guys. So yeah, overall, I think the Autark Skyrunner is, he's good. You farm command points with him, he's good. He can fit into some builds, if you just need something that safely can stay in reserve and farm command points, and that's all you're using it for, sure. But, it's just, he can't do much else, unfortunately. But yeah, anyways, feel free to disagree with me on this guy. I think, if he's better and I just don't know it, if there's a way you've been using him, I know some people were suggesting, running him with just saying, basically, forget it, F it, I'm going to run him with the Dragon Fusion Gun, and I'm going to go after stuff and score on secondaries and stuff with him and stuff like that, and if he dies, he dies, right? Or if I give him a Phoenix Gem, it makes it harder for the enemy to deal with them. So I think there is some argument to that, but I also do think, just in my mind, kind of what I'm thinking is you might as well go with the Way Leaper because it has infantry and you can move through ruins and stuff, which makes it a little bit easier to maneuver. Speaking of the Way Leaper, obviously I think we can all agree here, we don't even really have to talk about it, S tier. Now, why is he S tier? Well, quite frankly, it's because of Lone Operative, and because he does everything else that the other two Autarks do, but better, right? He is more maneuverable than the Autark on foot. In any other way, he's exactly the same, right? So he's more maneuverable and has Lone Operative on top of that. His ability is slightly better, giving +1 leadership to units within 6. While it doesn't seem that great, and in most cases it's not, armies that rely on, battle shock, it can help against that, and I've had a few scenarios myself where it did help. So it's not a useless ability like the, Autark on foot kind of is, or the Autark, Skyrunners is. So yeah, I think it's a pretty good ability that he has. It's not the best, but his main ability is going to be generating you command points, and because of that lone op, he's a really good objective camper, right? You can safely put on him an objective. You can safely kind of have him in corners of the board, so he's screening out enemy units. He's on a little bit of a bigger base, which does help with that. So, overall, I do think the Autark Way Leaper is the best option. And of course, the Autark Way Leaper also has the ability to take Manda Blasters, Howling Banshee Mask, stuff like that. So he can actually be a pretty good combatant as well, which is good, I mean, it helps to have something in your backfield that can also, have a little bit of a combat punch. So if your opponent brings in something like Intercessors or Inceptors, I should say, deep striking in, your Way Leaper has a very reasonable chance of being able to deal with those in the matter of a couple turns of combat. So I do think the Way Leaper is obviously the way to go here. It is expensive though, and if you don't want to pay the extra points for the utility that the Way Leaper brings, you can always go with the cheaper option. Okay, so really good model, definitely S tier. You see it in most people's lists. And in fact, you see Autarchs in basically everybody's list because that ability to regenerate command points is an absolute necessity for armies that have it. Okay, let's talk about the next big boy on the block, and that's the Avatar of Khaine. Now, I love the Avatar. I don't think he got a direct nerf, obviously, in the data slate, but I will say this: he is very Fate Dice dependent. You're going to be feeding Fate Dice into this guy because he is a model that is going to be very powerful. You're going to be wanting to feed sixes for Overwatch for him. You're going to be wanting to use fours for his invul save against, enemy heavy attacks. So, the reduction of Fate Dice does hurt the Avatar just a little bit. However, I don't think this stops him from being awesome, so he is an S tier unit. He's definitely now the premier primary objective holder. He does have some counters, but everything in the game has counters. It's okay that he has counters as long as you're aware of them and adjust to them accordingly, you'll be okay, right? So units that ignore modifiers to damage are very strong against him and can probably one round him. Watch out against Custodes because Custodes have, I think his name's Grimaldus, if I'm not mistaken. I may be wrong at the pronunciation and things like that of different things in 40k, but I think that's what he's called anyway. But he ignores damage modifiers, I believe, so that could be a nasty situation. You just want to be careful with him because he is a very expensive model and you do have to take care of him. Now, he also requires a lot of support. So you do need to bring a Farseer along with Fortune if you expect him to survive on a primary objective for more than a couple turns. You do need to kind of keep that in mind as well. So Avatar, really good unit, solid, really good board control, really good threat range. He has basically it all. And obviously very tough. And the Eldar, not being a tough faction, do need something to contest the midfield, unless you're just playing a very cagey, objective-based, objective-style list that's going to go more for damage. Okay, so next we have Baharoth. So Baharoth is one of the Phoenix Lords. I think he's good, but I don't think he's the best Phoenix Lord. His ability is more useful now since the data slate, since the nerf to Phantasm, I can tell you that. But my opinion of Baharoth is he just doesn't quite do enough for a Swooping Hawk unit to make it worth his points cost. So he does make a unit of Swooping Hawks 200 points, which, if you're thinking about Swooping Hawks as an objective-based unit, then he's not worth it, right? I think if you take him on his own, there could be some merit to that because he can shoot and scoot. But at that point, you might as well just take Shadow Specters. I think there's better units for the role for that shooting and scooting objective style play. And damage dealing, obviously, Shadow Specters being that unit. So I think he just gets overshadowed in a lot of ways, and I think that's why he's kind of in the B tier. You can use him, he's very usable. He can be good. He can, give your Swooping Hawks extra punch, extra, abilities to, move around, give them extra mobility. But is it worth the extra 125 points over another unit of Swooping Hawks and something else? I don't know that it is. Personally, I wouldn't do it. But, he is solid. I have nothing bad to say about him. I just think right now, as it stands, he doesn't do anything that really adds to the value of Swooping Hawks. So, he's a B tier unit. He is cool, though. Okay, next up, we actually have a Super Heavy. Now, this Super Heavy, I believe, is called the Cobra. Has a Mega D cannon. I think I want to say it's called the D Impaler, but I may be wrong about that. But yeah, I think it is called the D Impaler, and it's very powerful. Now, this being a super heavy, I can't really rank it along with most of the other units in the index. It is very powerful. However, it's not as good as the Scorpion. And I think, well, to be real with you guys, I think that the Scorpion is good, but it's not competitive. So this being not as good as the Scorpion, its ability isn't as great, especially in competitive play. People aren't going to be bunching their units around, the unit that you hit. They're going to be kind of more spread out, unless you're playing against a horde army, and again, the weapon isn't exactly a horde anti-horde weapon. So I think this is a D tier unit, competitively speaking. I think for fun games, it's awesome, and it's a super heavy and it's really cool and stuff. I just don't think it's ever going to see competitive play. It's really big. It, its ability isn't great. It's not going to ever really proc against more than one other additional unit, and its weapon isn't powerful enough to justify the cost that you pay. You're paying 400 and something points for this thing, and it's really difficult to maneuver around the battlefield effectively. So I think it's definitely D tier. And it doesn't really have the toughness to stand with other super heavies, like the guard super heavies that are really amazingly tough. And yeah, that's basically it though. I have nothing really more to say about it. It is cool, but it just doesn't pack the punch for the points and doesn't have the toughness for the points. And unlike other Eldar vehicles, it's really hard to maneuver and it's as a result kind of slow. Okay, so let's talk about Void Reavers and Void Scarred. So we'll talk about the Void Reavers first. They're the core option. Now, I think they're really interesting. I think with Scout and everything like that, I think they're even more interesting than last time around. However, I don't think they're quite pointed efficiently. I think they are kind of expensive, and that's a little bit of a bummer. But they can do some significant damage. They do get rerolls to hit against enemy units on objectives. Now, the one problem I have with this is that they kind of share a role with Wind Riders in that way, and I think Wind Riders are just kind of a step above Void Scarred in the damage that they can push out, but also the objective ability that they have. So 3 Wind Riders at 80 points, is almost the same cost as 5 Void Reavers, and you get objective play with the Wind Riders. You get Shuriken Cannons, which are better against heavier infantry, mech style targets, and the Wind Riders I just think have more play. But, Void Scarred or Void Reavers, I should say, are still pretty good. I would just say that they're B tier. I think they're a solid unit. The scout move is nice, It can bait out, some bad positioning on your opponent. You can, scout move back into terrain if you want, or if you get first turn, you can definitely scout move forward and get onto an objective early. That's always nice as well. So they have some play. I just don't think, it is highly incentivized that to get the full value out of the unit, you take them as a unit of 10, and there's no way to split them up. Like, Kabalite Warriors have a way to split them up, right? And that's why Kabalites are really good, because they have those sticky objectives. But with these guys, you're paying a premium for them. They're more expensive than Kabalites, and you can't split them up. So they're going to be in a unit of 10 if you want to take all the special options and stuff, and that can get pricey. That's 140 points. So you're looking at something that's the same points cost as a full unit of Dire Avengers. And Dire Avengers, while they are good, they're still really fragile, right? So you come into that, do I really want to just throw a really expensive unit out there that's not really good at trading, and basically do no damage in return? I don't really know, but I don't think it's a unit that is priced efficiently at the moment. But they do have cool rules, and if they were cheaper, I would definitely consider using more of them. I've actually had a lot of success in the beginning of the edition, at least. I don't know about now, but running these guys as a full army with Wave Serpent support. Of course, that was a different game because Eldar were a lot stronger as an index overall, but they can do really well in a transport. I would actually, if you want to run these guys and you want to be effective with them, I would run them in a Wave Serpent, because you get the bonus of having the full 10. They're protected in the Wave Serpent, and the Wave Serpent also gets the scout ability. So you can actually, have a scouting Wave Serpent, which is really cool, and it's a really cool, kind of thing. So if you're looking at doing a Corsair army, it's definitely possible. I'm not saying these guys are garbage, not at all, but they just require a lot of investment, and not a lot of people are willing to invest that in them. But if you're willing to go the extra mile with the Wave Serpent, the whole 9 yards, you can definitely make these guys much more effective for the points. Okay, Corsair Void Scarred. They're the elite version. They're kind of all over the place. I think they're still probably the best assassin unit in the Eldar Index, right? They're really good assassins at taking out characters in close combat. The problem is they compete with things that are cheaper and better at it. So what I actually found was that, you could run this with the Yvrain Death Ball, and you could run it with, the Vizark and stuff, and that's really good and everything, but it's overkill, right? It's overkilling a lot of characters in the game, and you're not getting the full value out of the unit that way. And the unit's also very easy to counter because you have a bunch of characters in it. Your opponent can just, either kill it before it gets to its destination, or just stay away from it, or just, give it kind of bait units and screen it out. For for less points and for the same job, you can have a solitaire, which also has precision, and you could just wipe the whole unit out, right? So that's the problem I have with the Void Scarred, is that they are good. Having lethal hits and precision against a target unit that you pick is really awesome, but your opponent can play around that, especially if they're an experienced player. They're not going to give you that perfect opportunity to just go in on that unit that you select. So, for those of you guys who don't know, the ability of the Void Scarred is to select a unit at the beginning of the game, and that unit they get lethal hits against, and they also get precision against. Again, really good ability for dealing with Death Stars, but a good opponent will say, okay, well then that unit needs to die, or I need to screen out that unit so that my Death Star isn't destroyed. So, where I stand with them is I actually think they have a little bit less play than Void Reavers. I would say they're probably a C tier unit because they're way more expensive, right? They're way more expensive. I think they're 180 points for 10. That's 18 points a model. And I know they get a lot of options, but they're still squishy space elves, and they're really not, in my view, elite enough to warrant that point cost. So I have to put them in C tier. Good unit, but I just don't think they're quite efficient. I think if they were cheaper, they'd have more play. Same thing really with the Corsair Void Reavers. I think that's my main concern about. I think GW kind of pushed them to that point level because they didn't want them to be spammed. Because they can also be taken in Dark Eldar, so they didn't want them to be, spammed in both armies, but I think they probably pushed them too far a little bit. Okay, Crimson Hunter. Cool. We get to talk about the old Crimson Hunter. So the Crimson Hunter is actually a unit that I didn't like in the beginning of the edition. I didn't think it was points effective, but as the edition has gone on and points increases have gone up, things like that, I actually do think it's a very viable unit to have in your army. I did a video on this a while back when somebody ran a Crimson Hunter in a tournament alongside the Yinkarn, and I think it's a great combination because flyers can ignore obscuring terrain. So you can come in on the board, you can hit, an enemy light tank in the backfield, you can destroy that enemy light tank, and then you can pop your Yinkarn out of it and it can charge something. I think it's a great wombo combo, and I think, it deserves a lot of credit because 160 points for 2 Bright Lances and a Pulse Laser, it can ignore obscuring terrain. It's not bad. It also comes with a 5-up invul, so if your opponent doesn't dedicate enough firepower to it, your opponent could very easily not be able to kill it. So, it has happened to me in a couple games where my opponent underestimated its durability, said, oh, I can kill that thing with, 3 last cannons. And then they fail. They whiff. Right? And I use my fate dice for that invul save. So I think this thing is very good. I would say it's even A tier. And I know that may shock some of you, but I think it is an A tier unit. And the reason being is because, again, being able to ignore obscuring terrain with an anti-tank platform, an anti-large platform, is very good, and it's a good thing to have in your list. So, even if you're not running the Yinkarn, I think for the points, it's pretty solid. It is cheaper than, a Fire Prism, and I think Fire Prisms are very good. Now, the only thing I will say about this is that since the nerf to Fate dice, this thing is a little bit less efficient because you don't have as many Fate dice to throw around, and chances are you're not going to really, you might, but you might not have a Farseer within 12 inches. So that is something you have to consider as well. Do I have the Fate dice required to make this thing worth it when it comes in, because it may well die in the next turn because it's a flyer. So that is something you have to consider, but it is a good vehicle, I think, and I think it could fit well in a lot of different builds. Okay, I'm going to actually grab some tea. All right, sorry about that tea sipping sound. So let's talk about Dark Reapers. Now, Dark Reapers, a lot of you would say, well, D for Dark Reapers are trash. I don't think they're trash. I think they're actually a really good unit. And the reason why I think they're a good unit is because they are the cheapest form of indirect fire that you can get in the Eldar Index. And indirect fire is a powerful control tool to have. It makes your opponent think about what they want to put on their back objective. So if they have something like cultists, or, if they're an Orc player and they have Gretchen or something like that in the back, or, if they're even, a Necron player and they think they can get away with just putting 3 Scarabs on their home objective, and that's going to be enough, well, a single unit of Dark Reapers for 80 points can say, you're going to need to put something more substantial on that back objective, because not only am I going to destroy your Scarabs back there, or your Cultists, or whatever, but I'm also going to bring my Swooping Hawks in on it, and I'm going to score on secondary objectives like, you know, storm hostile objective, or, take enemy outpost, right? So people have to watch out for the Dark Reapers. And they're only 80 points. It's not like you're investing in a Night Spinner, which is going to be a huge investment. 210 points now, right? Dark Reapers are cheap enough to where, you don't feel the pain of that bringing that indirect fire. The other thing Dark Reapers are really good at is they're good at efficiently dealing with light vehicles. Because they have strength 8 weapons, they can wound most light vehicles on 3s, and they're ignoring cover, and they're ignoring hit modifiers. So a lot of light vehicles also are very fast. Things like Dark Eldar Venoms have -1 to hit, but they don't have much armor, and they don't have many wounds or great toughness. They rely on, cover or hiding and stuff like that, and Dark Reapers just ignore that. So they can provide that indirect fire in the early game, but as the game goes on, you can step up with them, in line of sight of something, walk them forward and kill it. And they can kill a Venom in 1 turn of shooting, which is really good. They have the single shot, strength 8, AP -2, damage 2, star shot. Well, not star shot, but are they called star shot? The single shot Reaper launchers. I think they are called star shot. But yeah, you have the star shot and the star swarm. So, they can deal with the Venom very easily. And the great news is that you don't have to have them within line of sight at all times. So I think they are really good. I would go so far as to put them in A tier. Now, I know some people might disagree with that, again, and that's fine. They're not really showing up in a lot of competitive lists, but I think having 1 unit at least of Dark Reapers in your, kind of army can very well put enough pressure on certain opponents to make them worth it. Just including them in your army can make it worth it. And the Tempest Launcher, it's not the greatest weapon out there. It's only strength 4, 2d6 attacks and blast, but it's something your opponent has to worry about. And over the course of 2 turns, because it ignores hit modifiers, it can definitely kill, units of 10 light infantry on a back objective. So it is something to consider. I think Dark Reapers are a unit that people should have their eyes on going forward. Okay, let's talk about the Death Jester. Now, I think the Death Jester is a really good unit. I think, like a lot of things, it took a hit because it relied on Fate dice to get those extra sustained hits. But I still think it's fantastic, and I would still put it in A tier. I think it's great, right? It's a lone op. It really kills mech targets very efficiently. It kills characters very efficiently in units, weak characters. Necrons are on the rise. It would be good to have a Death Jester with Fate's Messenger to be able to deal with, Phasmancers and Technomancers and all that kind of stuff, right? That are, buffing up those Wraith units or those Immortal units. So yeah, I just think he's a fantastic character. He does a lot of damage. He has the utility of being able to take out, enemy characters and stuff. And because he's a lone op, he can do stuff like, get to certain places of the board to score secondaries, or basically just be immune to enemy return fire. So I think he's a pretty good unit. And I know I've talked a lot about the Death Jester in the past, so we'll leave it at that. But he is very strong. Okay, Dire Avengers. I'm going to put them, before saying anything, I'm just going to put them in B tier, because I think one of the things that I loved about Dire Avengers before was the cheekiness of being able to Overwatch on 4+ and then Phantasm back, right? And I think that made them really strong, except against, things like with a lot of indirect fire, right? But they just can't do that anymore. So if you do run Dire Avengers, you have to use them aggressively in a Wave Serpent, and you might not have them the next turn. And if you're spending 140 points for that, they have to trade at least 140 points worth of models, in my view, right? So that means you shoot with them, they do, at least 70 points worth of damage. You Overwatch with them, they do at least 70 points, so they make up their points. That's just how I see them, because they can't really control objectives. I know they get bonuses for control being on an objective they control, but they don't have the OC or the durability to stay on objectives, which I think makes them a little bit awkward. And I think, running them in 5-mans could work, but for 5 more points, you can take a unit of Swooping Hawks, and Swooping Hawks get 1 additional attack at the cost of 1 AP. But they get a bunch of other stuff with secondary objectives. So I think that Swooping Hawks just are probably just your better option. And I think Swooping Hawks outcompete these guys when it comes to, maybe not just raw firepower because of the Overwatch in a unit of 10, of course, but they definitely outcompete them in versatility of what they can take on and what they can do in a battle. And that's why I think, Dire Avenger's still solid, but probably a B tier unit now. I like them a lot, but you do have to invest in them a little bit more. And because they don't have Phantasm anymore, there's just less you can do with them. Another thing I really liked doing was if I was going against an Assault type army and I had the Wave Serpent, I liked to Phantasm them back around the Wave Serpent so that, my opponent couldn't charge them and stuff. So, that combo is just dead. And I think a lot of the things that they could do to be tricky, unfortunately, is just something that is a thing of the past. But who knows? Maybe they don't, maybe they take back the nerf a little bit and we get a little bit of that power back. Who knows? Okay. Eldrad. Let's talk about Big Eldrad. Eldrad, I would have considered him a B tier unit before. I think he's come up to A tier. And the reason why is because we're going to be using a lot more stuff that's going to require us to have better wound rolls. Fire dragons, falcons with, bright lances and pulse lasers. The meta it's going super heavy, guys. There's people running, lots of Imperial Guard super heavies. You're seeing a rise of Imperial Knights. Imperial Knights are coming back to play because they got buffed. So you're seeing a lot of T12, T13 sometimes models coming back to the board, and those things can be scary. And those things are really hard for Bright Lances alone to take out, and that's where Eldrad comes in because of Doom. If you really need something dead, Doom is going to help every single unit in your army be able to kill that target more effectively. So yes, Eldrad, you do need line of sight for Doom and stuff. Granted, it is a 2+, you could roll that one, but again, that's Warhammer, right? As long as you have a good chance of casting it, it's just like any other power. Now, the other thing is Eldrad gives you Fate dice. We have less Fate dice to work with now, so that's a big benefit. And Eldrad also has Mind War, which isn't the best thing about him, but it is nice to know that you can probably kill a lesser character in a unit with it. So if you can Doom a unit, help the rest of your army kill something, and then Mind War something else, you could even do it on the same unit just to, extra kill, kill the character, and then whatever buffs he's giving the unit, and then, the unit then dies. Like, Mind War is really good against Imperial Guard units that are, relying on orders and things like that, relying on, their commanders to be able to, make them better, give them sustained hits, or give them, any kind of buff, like, it's good. It's a really good way to deal with those characters. It's not going to be able to take out big stuff, but with anti-character 4+ and just a base strength of 5, especially if you combine that with Doom, you're wounding a lot of lesser characters on 2+. So it's not like it's a strength 2 weapon that relies on anti-character, right? So yeah, Eldrad, really good. I think he is 110 points, which a lot of people would say is expensive, but, I mean, it is, but then again, he does a lot for your army. And I think that he is very strong. Now, how do you want to run Eldrad? It's kind of up to you. I think it's too expensive to run him with bodyguards. Personally, he's already 110 points by himself. I think you run him by himself. You throw him in reserve, regular reserve. You come out in reserve. He's small enough to where you can kind of fit him so that your opponent has trouble screening him out. Or you put him in a Falcon. Falcon does give him rerolls to wound, but I mean, that's not really a big deal at all. Like, it's pretty negligible considering if he's by himself at least, he's going to get a reroll to wound anyway. So really the only reason to put him in a Falcon is to have him come out with whatever unit is inside, like Fire Dragons or something like that. So that is a possibility as well, and because Doom is used in the shooting phase and so is Mind War, it's not a big deal. So yeah, Eldrad, pretty good model. I would personally just run him in reserve. I think that's the best way to run him, but you can also run him in a transport as well. That's also decent. All right, let's talk about the Falcon. So the Falcon, S tier. It has really come into its own with the nerfs of other units and the increases in points and stuff of, the premier anti-large units in our army. We're now having to rely on units like Fire Dragons more. Fire Dragons are very efficient trading units, and the Falcon is priced very efficiently for what it does. And it gives a really solid boost to the arguably most efficient trading unit in our index, which is the Fire Dragons. But it's also good with other stuff. And then, a lot of people think of it as a tax, but it's actually not a tax. It doesn't just drop off units like the Wave Serpent does. You can use it in a variety of different ways, and because it's packing a Pulse Laser and Bright Lance, it's also a good anti-large platform as well. So I think it's really strong. Now, especially with the recent changes to units that can disembark from transports after coming out of reserve, this thing has Deep Strike. So this thing can Deep Strike in, drop off whatever unit you have, Fire Dragons or whatever. Now keep in mind that you do have to still stay outside of 9 inches, so you can't get within that melter range, which is why I probably wouldn't always do this. But if you don't need that extra melta damage, and you're just, using it as something to take out, regular Space Marines or, things with 2 wounds or 1 wound, then you can definitely use it in Deep Strike, and it can give you some versatility and some options. So I do think that's a really good, strategy as well for certain, or just, if you're running a triple Falcon list, you can put one of them in reserve and stuff like that, just to give your opponent something to think about. Okay, so that is the Falcon. Very strong model. Definitely going to see more of that in competitive lists going forward. The Farseer, S tier. Now, obviously, I think the Farseer has taken a bit of a hit because Wraithguard have, so I think you're going to see less of the Farseer and maybe more of the Skyrunner. But I think armies are still going to have to probably, not have to, but they're probably going to be, wanting a Farseer in their army to make their Fate Dice more efficient. So having Fortune is still pretty good. I know a lot of people, again, even me, like I think obviously the lack of Wraithguard is going to be a problem. But if you're running the Avatar of Cain, you're going to need a Farseer for support. If you're not running Wraithguard, but maybe Wraith Blades, Farseer is a very good idea, for holding primary objectives. If you're not running any of those units, you're not running anything tough, and you're just going for purely objective and, just a fast, hard-hitting kind of list with Falcons, Fire Dragons, and other Aspect Warriors, a Farseer is still pretty effective because you can take Storm Guardians. Now, hear me out on this. You can take Storm Guardians. They're another great unit. You could throw Fortune on them, and that means that bolters, instead of wounding on 3s, are wounding you on 4s. And if you throw lightning fast reflexes on the unit as well, I know that's 2 command points, or 1 command point to do that to Storm Guardians. But if your Storm Guardians can survive on an objective, and your opponent can't take that objective wave from you, that's free, that's free primary victory points in the first couple turns of the game, right? The second turn. So it can be very helpful to do that. And, I always run Storm Guardians with a Farseer just because I can really throw off people's expectations of how tough Storm Guardians are on an objective, People will not expect Storm Guardians to be that tough. Oh, my Space Marines are now hitting on 4s and wounding on 4s. That's ridiculous. Against Space Elves, they basically become the durability of Space Marines against Bolter Fire, A little bit less, obviously, because they have a 4+ save, but, if they're in cover, they're getting a cover save. So they're basically getting a 3-up save. They're basically Space Marines. Which, your opponent is going to have to leverage some heavier amount of firepower to be able to deal with that. So I still think the Farseer is useful, even in lists. Yeah, you're not going to throw Fortune on a Falcon, but you can definitely throw it on some infantry squad that your opponent is only going to be able to allocate certain resources to kill to, and that can be really useful. Okay, let's talk about the Farseer Skyrunner. Also, S tier. Now, Guide is very strong. I think if you're running an MSU style list, Guide may be less strong because you're going to be getting that reroll to hit and wound, but having full rerolls on something is really good, and it's whiff proof, right? Like, you could whiff with 1 reroll, but it's harder to whiff with all rerolls. So if I have a unit of fire dragons, well, that's probably a bad example because they're coming out of a falcon. You wouldn't be able to guide that anyway. But, if I have a unit of, I don't know, shadow specters, for example, and I'm shooting at a horde of enemy infantry coming at me, I'm playing against Imperial Guard or something like that, and I roll my, you know, God, it's going to be so many dice, but I roll my 40 dice, and most of them are, I only hit like a third of them. I roll really bad. Guide is a great way to make sure that you don't roll that bad, right? Reroll all of the hits, not just one hit, but all of them. It's also decent for fire prisms. People don't think about this, but fire prisms have a 2d6 attack shot. So, if you are out of large targets to hit, it is 2d6, it is rather swingy, and yeah, you may be getting the 2 rerolls with the fire prism, but that's not all of them, and if you roll bad, you can easily be missing more than just 2 dice. So being able to reroll all the hits is helpful. So I think the Farseer Skyrunner is a good option. Of course, he's more maneuverable, so you can maneuver him around the battlefield to benefit other units or different units with branching fates, which again is helpful. It's something that the Farseer on foot has a little bit of trouble doing. So I definitely think, though, that the Farseer Skyrunner is also an S tier unit. Okay, Fire Dragons. Definitely an S tier unit, especially now. I thought they were really good before, and I was, saying that they were an A tier unit because, they just got kind of, in my view, outcompeted with a couple of other units at the time in the beginning of the edition. Like D cannons, for example, could just, wreck everything for the same points. But now, since the changes and since the nerfs, I think Fire Dragons are obviously the most effective trading unit in the entire index. They're fantastic. Dragon fusion guns, Melta 3 is really strong, especially on a unit that basically just is equipped with just that. A lot of Space Marine units are either really expensive, like Eradicators are extremely expensive. I think they're the ones with the Meltas anyway. And Fire Dragons are cheap. 85 points for 5 Melta guns. That's amazing. And they're improved Melta guns with an ability that is also just better at dealing with tanks, right? They have that rerolls ones to wound, as well as the rerolls ones on damage. The ones to wound is a little bit, I could take it or leave it because of the Falcon, giving it full rerolls to wound. But the reroll ones to damage is extremely good because if you whiff on the damage roll, which I've often done, you can just reroll it. And weirdly enough, sometimes those results come out as a 6. You roll a 1, and then it comes out a 6 or a 5. So it can actually come out really nice for you, and I think that's a great ability to have on the unit for something that's so cheap, Only having to spend 85 points on this unit is brilliant, and being cheap enough to be effectively put into a Falcon, make it more maneuverable, to kind of shore up the weaknesses of the unit, which are it's fragile, it's short-ranged, right? The Falcon just pairs along with it brilliantly. And I think, yeah, Fire Dragon's definitely an S tier unit, and you're going to be seeing a lot of them because they're some of the best answers we have to the Necron Menace, monoliths, and of course, the Satan. Okay, so moving on to the Fire Prism. Fire Prism is S tier. I think the Fire Prism is going to be back because it is Fate Dice independent, doesn't need Fate Dice to operate efficiently, and because we have less Fate Dice now, we're going to have to be starting to think about putting some of these units in our lists so that we can, kind of have a little bit more even coverage where we want to. I don't think you're going to see people spamming 3 Warwalkers anymore. I think that age is over. You don't have as much leeway to do stuff like that anymore because, you just have less Fate Dice. So I think Fire Prisms are going to step up to the plate. I can easily see a lot of lists running a couple of these. I think the Triple Prism may be a little bit expensive still, just to be real with you guys. I think it's too expensive. But, a double Prism where you can kind of get the right angles on certain targets can be very effective. And of course, they double as an anti-infantry platform as well. So I think definitely an S tier unit and much improved just, based on the other nerfs that we've seen. Okay, next up is Fuegan, and yes, I am going to call him Fuegan. I realize that some people pronounce him differently, but I've always called him that, and it just sounds right to me. He's a man of fire. He's an elf of fire. In Spanish, fuego is fire, so I'm just going to call him Fuegan. That's just me, and we'll leave it at that. Okay, so Fuegan is S tier, and to be real, he was S tier even before the nerfs. I think he's fantastic. He's an inbuilt Phoenix gem. He does great damage 3 attacks against targets like Terminators. His fire axe is very potent in close combat, and his weapon is just absolutely amazing. It has Melta 6, so it's one of the things that if the Satan or whatever fails its invul, or vehicle fails its invul save, Melta 6 is going to be going through. You can switch a fate dice to a 6 as well on this guy, and he could just hit it for 12 damage. That's absolutely insane. He has the potential to, not quite, but basically almost half shot a hard target, right? Like a monolith, or, do a ton of damage to a Satan. So he's really good. And, again, he resurrects himself. So I think that goes without saying. A lot of things in our index that can resurrect themselves and just be generally hard to deal with are going to be great models. So he's awesome. The problem is finding the actual model for him, which can be a little bit difficult. So unless you're, combing eBay every day or willing to pay a higher price, it's a little bit difficult. Hopefully, Fire Dragons and, just all the models in our range get an update at some point. Alright, let's talk about Guardian Defenders. Now, Guardian Defenders, in my view, were a unit that was probably, maybe a B tier, maybe even a C tier unit before the changes. I think they're probably closer to A tier, maybe kind of on the borderline between A and B. The reason being is because I think with, Hypercrypt Legion, and the Drukhari, there's a lot more very fast armies that can probably get within your deployment zone very quickly, and I think these guys are great for screening your backfield, so you don't have to worry about things deep striking in, Inceptors deep striking in and taking the key target out, taking out your Autarch Wayleaper because we don't have a good Phantasm anymore, or taking out your Death Jester. It's going to be helpful to have a unit that could sit in the backfield, farm you some extra fate dice, shoot a Bright Lance downrange, and also just give you more bodies, right? Just give you more screening room so that you don't have to have important units in the backfield babysitting your characters. So I think this is a really, genuinely a good pick for a lot of reasons, right? And again, just to reiterate, fate dice generation, screening ability, Bright Lance, which is of course still strong, and they do decent damage. They actually trade pretty evenly with a lot of other battle line units in the game. Intercessors, they trade very evenly with them. And I said this in the very beginning of the edition. You put 5 Intercessors against 10 Guardians, and they're going to effectively trade evenly in the shooting game. It would take the Intercessors charging into the unit of Guardian Defenders to actually beat them. But in a shooting match, the Guardian Defenders actually do a little bit better. And again, partially because of the weapon platform, but also just partially because they have good damage, right? Strength 4, 2 shots, AP -1 is solid as well. Okay. Hemlock Wraithfighter. And I wish the Hemlock Wraithfighter was good. It's such a cool model. But unfortunately, I'm going to have to give this the old D tier treatment. Now, for context, the reason why it's D tier isn't because it's so bad it's unusable. It's definitely usable for fun. I just think that, any model that is reliant on getting a lot of damage in quickly when it comes in, as all flyers are, or performing some vital task, I don't think the Hemlock does either of those things. I don't think it comes in and does a reliable amount of solid damage to anything. If you roll high, you can definitely do some good damage, but it hits on 4+. You can't use guide on it because it's coming from reserves. You can't even, buff its shooting. It has 2d6 attacks, which just make it very swingy. So it's a very risky and unreliable, unit. I think if somebody is one of those people who loves to just sit at a slot machine all day and just put quarters in, quarter after quarter, and torture yourself at the slots, I think this is a great unit for that player because it's very high risk and decent reward. So you might put $500 into that slot machine and you might win $450 and think you've won big time, the jackpot. But in reality, if you play a lot of games with this thing, you're going to have just as many disappointments, if not more, than you do happy moments. So as of now, I just don't think it's a great model. The other bad design flaw about this thing is it's Mind Shock Pod is only 9-inch range, but you have to stay outside of 9 inches when you come in from reserve with this thing. Like, who was thinking that was a good idea to make it a 9-inch range? Why not just make it a 12-inch range so that it can use its Mind Shock Pod right away for -1 to Battle Shock and Leadership tests? It's not even a good ability. Anyway, I just think this thing was poorly designed, and I don't like it at all. Okay, so let's talk about the Hornet. So the Hornet is solid, still good. I think that, though, again, with the nerf of Fate Dice, I just think that Bright Lances are going to be a little bit less efficient. People are going to have to look towards other things, right? Bright Lances are good, but there's a lot of heavier stuff in the game now that's becoming, more, meta picks and so forth. And Strength 12 just kind of isn't cutting it. Wounding on 5+, and then of course people have stratagems usually and stuff to buff the toughness of their big vehicles as well. So just ends up not doing a lot of damage. And because this thing is so fragile, if it gets shot back, it's going to die. Unlike the Warwalker, which can kind of protect itself with -1 to wound and a 4+ invul. So I'm going to just say it's B tier. Pure and simple. I think it's good. I think Hornets are good. I just don't think they're that good at trading anymore. And because the Eldar army is now more expensive, I just don't think there's much room for it in the index. But, I could be wrong. I think one Hornet is cool. I just don't think you'll see people spamming them really anymore. Okay. Oh, but I do think it's probably on the upper end of B tier. I don't think it's complete B. I wouldn't put it on the same level as like the Autarch Skyrunner or anything like that. I would probably put it above that, but I just don't think it's quite an A tier unit anymore. Okay, Howling Banshees. Howling Banshees are probably a little bit of a disappointment, but I would actually say that they're much better than they were. Now, I would have probably put them I would say probably closer to D tier before, but I actually think they're a C tier unit now and probably on the higher end of C tier. And the reason being is because the Dark Eldar matchup they are extremely good in. They are a 100% counter to Incubi. They have fights first, so if Incubi want to charge into them, the Howling Banshees will kill them before they get the chance to strike. I think that's a very powerful counter. Now, will they be able to do this against every army? No. Pretty much only Dark Eldar and only armies that have just very dedicated close combat units that don't shoot, and they're also kind of, not that tough. So I think really that's only really good against other Eldar and Dark Eldar. The other thing about Howling Banshees, though, is that they kind of don't hit hard, so you have to really place them well. And I did a video on Howling Banshees a while back, and I think they can be used in strategic reserve to kind of go wherever you need them. You need to finish off a unit in close combat, that's been weakened from shooting, but, needs to be charged. You can come out of strategic reserve, via rapid ingress, and you can charge that unit, finish it off on an objective and stuff like that. And then if your opponent tries to countercharge you with something, you strike first. So there are ways in which you can use Howling Banshees to be effective, but I don't think there's enough opportunities for them to really shine for their points cost. Could be because they are kind of expensive. They're 85 points. They cost just as much as a unit of Fire Dragons, and they really don't trade efficiently at all. And you kind of have to use them in more of a utility role, right? You have to use them as a unit that cleans up other units, and they just don't hit very hard in close combat. But they are still decent. I wouldn't say that they're terrible. I just don't think they're cost effective. Okay, Illic Nightspear. Illic Nightspear is A tier. Now, I would put him in S tier because obviously having a unit of Rangers that can reroll wounds and is a lone op is really good. But with the nerf to Phantasm, units like Inceptors and, Hypercrypt Legion with the Stratagem can get within 3 inches or just outside of 3 inches of that unit, shoot it, and the Rangers have no realistic way of getting out of range, right? The average amount of movement you will get is 2d6. And that's just not enough, right? 2d6 from Phantasm and from the Ranger ability that allows you to move d6. It's not enough to put you outside of lone op range. So that means on average dice rolls, that unit is going to die every time your opponent is allowed to drop a unit within 3 inches. And that to me just basically brought him from S tier to A tier. Because now the number one reason that you're taking him, it's now very risky. You might not be able to save that unit, right? Unless you roll really high and spend a lot of resources, which you probably shouldn't be doing. I do think he's still good. I think having, lone op on an objective is good and everything. We just have other units for that too, right? Rangers are probably a better unit for screening. They're probably a better unit for, being in the mid board, securing objectives and board control early on in the game. They should be, used for that purpose. I think we have better units that can sit on a backfield objective, quite frankly, right? If you really want to, you can sit on there with an Autarch Wayleaper, or you can sit on there with a Death Jester if you take one of those. There's other units for that, especially since Guardians are becoming more popular. You can use them for that as well. I do still like Illic. I think rerolling to wound is a really powerful ability with sniper rifles, especially if you can draw a bead to a target. But with all the line of sight blocking terrain, obscuring terrain nowadays, it's just a little bit less effective than you would think. So he's still really good. Having lone op on a unit like that is very strong. It's just not S tier strong because there are strong counters to it now that Phantasm has been done away with. Okay, next up, it looks like we have the Epic Irilith. That is the Phoenix Lord for the Shadow Specters. D tier. And here's why. He costs more than a unit of Shadow Specters. And he doesn't really do anything for the unit. His ability basically is just like the Hemlock Wraithfighter ability, but I think it's a 6-inch range. You're never going to really want your unit within 6 to just have -1 to battle shock and leadership. His weapon is very awkward. He has awkward damage profiles. He has damage 4 on his Spear of Twilight, which is strange because even though that can be effective against things like Custodes and things like that, things with 4 wounds, it's not exactly something that 2 Shuriken Cannons can handle, right? Which do pretty much the same thing. They equal to 4, so you're not wasting damage. So I don't know. I just think he's one of those characters that the unit itself does more damage, and he doesn't bring anything to the unit. So to me, he's just wasted points. So I definitely think he's a D tier unit. I may be being a little bit hard on the guy, but realistically, I just think he's just awful, right? He doesn't really do anything. His ability's terrible. You might as well just take another unit of Spectres. So D tier for sure. Okay. Jane Czar. C tier. She does do powerful damage, which I think is her saving grace, and free heroic intervention can sometimes be good, but I just don't think it's something that's going to come up that often. You really have to plan a lot for it. Your opponent can outplay that very easily. So I think Jane Czar, while she does a lot of damage in combat, that's all she does. She doesn't add anything to the unit of Howling Banshees. In fact, she makes the Howling Banshees so expensive that now they're, not going to trade as effectively against a lot of targets. So, this is now a 200 point unit, right? Close to a 200 point unit if you include Jane Czar in it. Jane Czar, super cool. I just don't think she's as good as some of the other combat Phoenix Lords that we'll talk about next. Well, one in particular, which, speaking of, is Kahandris. And he's an A tier unit because he does a ton of damage, and now with the meta evolving to include falcons, I think he's really strong out of a falcon. He has devastating wounds against mostly everything except Titanic units. That includes monsters and vehicles. That makes him extremely good at punching through armor and invul saves, especially when he gets, again, to reroll wounds out of a falcon with devastating wound weapons. He's really strong. On top of that, he has an ability where if he charges, he gets bonus sustained hits, which is awesome. It means he gets more attacks. So he's a powerhouse in melee. And yeah, he's not the most durable, but you use him, you hit something hard, you hit a hard target with him, and you make a trade because he's not that expensive. I think he's around 100. He's around 100 points. He's one of the cheaper Phoenix Lords. So I think he's really good out of Falcon. I probably don't think you infiltrate with him just because of the fact that, you don't want him just to die. You want him to be able to hit something before he dies. and you want to be able to get him to reroll those wounds. So, unlike regular striking scorpions that, you probably do want to infiltrate unless you have a spare falcon without fire dragons in it, you do want this guy to just ride along in a falcon, probably with some fire dragons to act as a combat unit. They can just basically take something out. And it could also save your fire dragons, because this guy, obviously very good in combat, someone wants to charge in, there is that option of heroic intervention, stuff like that. So he can actually do some really good counter punching as well. Okay, on to the Lynx. The Lynx is B tier. The Lynx is basically 5 Bright Lances. The Lynx Pulsar is extremely powerful. You get to advance and shoot with it, which is really good. My only issue with the Lynx is that the model is kind of awkward to move into ruins and around ruins. But that's it. Essentially, it's very fast, but the other issue with it is it can't really fire from a safe angle, and it will probably die. It's a little bit tougher than a Fire Prism. It does have a 5+ invul save. It does have more wounds, but it's still toughness 9. It's still an Eldar vehicle, so it'll probably still go down in one round of shooting. So it is a little bit, it's basically the same cost as a Fire Prism, and it's not going to be, firing every single turn. Now, the good news is you can still use Fire and Fade on it, so you can get it to safety, but, it is still essentially going to be more vulnerable than a Fire Prism would be. So you do have to, play carefully with it. I think it is good. I just don't think it's probably as safe as a Fire Prism, and damage-wise, it's comparable. The reason I say comparable is because it is one of those units that, yeah, it has 4 shots. They are at a high strength. It's D6 damage, which is good. But it's not quite as strong as a Prism, right? It doesn't quite get to that level. And to explain it to anybody who's, kind of wondering why, it's about the rerolls. You get 1 reroll to hit, 1 reroll to wound with this thing. You get full rerolls to hit and wound with a Fire Prism, which makes it extremely efficient. And because it's just flat 6 damage, that makes it a lot more reliable, especially since you can link fire with other prisms. So I do think, though, if you want to run, 2 prisms and a Lynx, I think that could be a good idea if you want to kind of run something up the battlefield to engage. But, I think just my view on it is it's probably a little bit too hard to maneuver between, ruins and stuff like that, but it is good. I like it. It's probably on the upper end of B tier, closer to A tier, but, just not quite there. It just needs a little bit of something to, really push it over the edge and push it into being competitive. Okay, we have Moggen Raw is next, and Moggen Raw is C tier. And just simply because of the fact that he's really cool and everything, he's really cool with Dark Reapers, but he doesn't really add anything to a Dark Reaper unit, right? I mean, a lot of people think about running him in a Falcon with Dark Reapers and stuff like that. It's a cool idea, but it just doesn't punch hard enough, in my view. And he's kind of a more expensive Phoenix Lord, So paying those points for something that isn't always going to be able to be beneficial for his ability, which is, against targets that are below half strength, he gets rerolls to hit and wound. Well, if you're already rerolling all your wounds and you're already rerolling a hit and you're hitting on 2+ and you ignore modifiers, I don't know if that's that great. Right? I mean, I just don't know if it's that great. And I believe he does ignore modifiers as well, just like his Dark Reaper brothers, but I could be mistaken. Let me just double check this real quick. Truth be told, I've only run him once this edition, but his damage just wasn't good for the points. So let's take a look at this. So actually, it looks like he doesn't ignore hit modifiers. So that's an issue. So that means, if somebody has a -1 to hit, he's hitting on 3+, which is a little bit. Yeah. The good news is, though, is that if he's with a unit of Dark Reapers, he does get their ability, because it just says each time a model in this unit. It doesn't specify Dark Reaper. So if he's with Dark Reapers, he gets to ignore the hit modifiers. If he's by himself, he doesn't. So with Dark Reapers, he's still really good because, But he's just not that good. I don't think he's worth, the points you pay for him. I'd probably rather have something else, like a Death Jester, for example, which is around the same cost. So, yeah, he's okay. I just think a lot of his abilities don't synergize with Dark Reapers, and I think that's my biggest issue with him. Okay, on to the Night Spinner. The Night Spinner has been nerfed severely. It got a points increase, and it got an ability nerf. Where is it now? Boop. B tier. I still think it's good. I just don't think it's fantastic. It's not going to be spammed. But its ability is still powerful at preventing things from charging, and Eldar sometimes need a little bit of board control, right? You need units that can exert board control, and I think this is a good unit for it. It's, it is expensive. It is 210 points. But it does have that ability. Now, whether you think that ability is worth it or not still is up to you, but I think it's still a powerful enough ability to warrant being in the middle of the pack as far as strength, right? It still does have twin linked devastating wounds, so it can take out, guaranteed basically a target behind terrain that's, has a few models left in it or something like that. If somebody's trying to hide a Space Marine to score on a secondary objective, a Night Spinner can take it out pretty easily. Whereas, a unit of Dark Reapers might not actually be able to take out that Space Marine, depending on dice rolls and stuff, but a Night Spinner has that guarantee. So, I still think it's worth having probably at least one in some builds. I just don't think it's worth having more than that because they're just too expensive. So yeah, I do think it's B tier. Just probably solid, middle of the pack B tier. Still useful in a lot of scenarios, but just not as good. The Nightwing. Okay, so the Nightwing is D tier. It's just a worse Crimson Hunter in every way. Instead of having a pulse laser, it has a twin-linked shuriken cannon. Instead of having two bright lances, it just has a single twin-linked bright lance. It is worse in every way to a Crimson Hunter. The only thing it has for it is that it can hover, I believe, and that's it. And even then, being able to hover, it just doesn't have the firepower for the cost to be effective. So it's garbage. Don't use it in your army, but it is a cool model, and I think it's a really cool Crimson Hunter proxy. So if you wanted to use it for Crimson Hunter proxy, or just for just having fun with it, rule of cool, it is a cool model. It's just absolute garbage rules wise. Okay, next we have the Revenant Titan. I think this is the Revenant Titan if I'm not mistaken, and this is the Phantom Titan. But correct me if I'm wrong because I don't know the images exactly. So Revenant Titan is going to be hard to judge, but if I was playing an Apocalypse style game, I'd probably end up putting it in C tier just because it does a lot of damage, but it is a lot of points, and you have to pay a bunch of command points to use anything on it. So yeah, I mean, it's just really expensive. Now, the cool thing about it though is that its weapons are really devastating. They're basically like Wraith Knight weapons taken to another level, which makes sense because it actually costs 2,100 points. You can only field this thing in games above that level. Is pretty good, but just not super effective. You can't even use it in regular games, so I don't even know if it should be on this tier list. But it is kind of cool, so I don't know. I'll just put it in C tier because it's cool, but, can't use it in regular games, so. Anyway. Okay. Rangers. S tier. Now, I've always thought these guys were great because they're basically in every list, and I think they are the unsung heroes of 10th edition because they just do so much for you. They allow you to screen out enemy opponents. Opponents can't infiltrate if you get them down first. It's really good at preventing, you're kind of getting surrounded and, enemies being in your deployment zone turn one, scoring on secondaries. So that's really great. Their sniper attacks aren't the greatest. I mean, they're worse than Imperial snipers, if you can believe that. But, that doesn't really matter. That's not really their purpose. They're more of, for move blocking and stuff like that. They're very cheap. They're only 55 points. So, being able to move block with them or, screen or, like I said before, kind of like use them to, prevent enemies from getting on objectives early in the game is really good. And, I think they're a solid unit overall. And because they're so cheap, they can be used expendably and to score, secondaries without fear of, losing a valuable unit. So definitely a very important unit. S tier unit for sure. Okay. Revenant Titan. Again, probably shouldn't be ranking these along with regular stuff, but I I think it's C tier, right? I mean, you could field it. It's 1100 points. You could field it in a game. It's not great, especially with the nerfs to Titanic and towering and things like that, being able to not, get line of sight on targets. But I think it's pretty good. It has some pretty cool weapons. I'd probably again not be able to rate it alongside normal stuff, so take this with a grain of salt. But you could throw fortune on it, you could make it extra tough, you could throw guide on it, make it extra shooty. I think there's a lot of buffs that these guys benefit a lot from, being so massive. But it is fragile for the cost. It's 1100 points. Enemies can easily take these things out in one turn if they just focus their entire army on it. So not very competitive, but really cool and fun, and you can make it work. I would probably put one of these things in reserve myself, but that's just me. You could start it on the board if you wanted to, if you were playing for fun. They are very strong, just, for the points, they're fragile. Okay, we got the Scorpion Grav Tank. This is going to be, basically alongside, well, yeah, this is it's probably going to be a little bit better than the Cobra, but not by much. And the only reason I say that is because the Scorpion Pulsar is extremely strong, and it is better than the D Impaler. But again, this is a very large model, very hard to maneuver around the battlefield. Basically gets stuck in your deployment zone sometimes. You can't even move it, it's so big. And overall, I just don't think tough enough to really warrant the huge points cost and massive investment that it needs to be. And the ability isn't that great either. Being able to proc Deadly Demise on a 4 plus rather than a 6 plus is kind of useless. And your opponent is going to keep his units away from vehicles if that's the case. And it's really not going to be that helpful for you. So I think it is better than the Cobra, but not by much. I would say this is a lower C tier unit. Shadows here. Let's just skip the formalities here. D tier. The reason why it's D tier is because it does nothing for the unit at all. If you're running your Harlequins in a Transport Starweaver, it cannot use its ability to give them a 6-inch advance. And on top of that, well, I mean, that's all there is to say, right? You can't use the ability, and you want to run these guys in Starweavers. If you're running a big pack of 10, you're probably still better off going with the Devastating Wounds Troopmaster over, a 6-inch advance. And this thing doesn't even have a psychic shooting attack. It's really disappointing, and it's more expensive than a Troopmaster. So it's worse in every way to a Troopmaster, and really doesn't benefit the unit at all. And yeah, that's why it's in D tier. I think it goes without saying, if a unit is outcompeted in every single way by another character that, is supposed to share the same role as it has, and it's also more expensive, then it's going to be the worst unit that you can possibly take. Okay, Shadow Spectres. So Shadow Spectres, S tier. Very strong unit. Amazing unit, in fact. They are one of, and this is, again, this is my opinion. Some people may not share this opinion, but they do everything well. They score objectives well. They shoot well. They stay safe well. You don't have to invest much in them. But if you wanted to invest in them, the option is open to you. If you want to throw guide on them, they're good with guide. But they don't need it because they have good damage to begin with. Right? They have very versatile shooting, which can take out heavy 3-wound targets, which are, something that there's not a lot of in the Eldar army, so that's very unique and very great. They're also one of the best tools for dealing with light infantry, especially in huge blobs. So, people are running a bunch of light infantry in a unit. Well, these guys have blast. So they have strength 4 AP -1 blast, which is really powerful against those units. These guys, even just 5 of them, are going to be able to, on average dice, kill a unit of guardsmen that are not benefiting from any defensive orders. So that's very strong. For 95 points, you're able to kill, more points than the unit's worth in a single shooting phase. That's amazing. So I think a really great unit. And, on top of it all, they also have -1 to hit, so they're a little bit more resilient against indirect fire because, a lot of indirect fire weapons have the heavy keyword. So that means they negate the penalty for indirect. So they still have that penalty when firing at Shadow Spectres because of stealth. And they also have a 3+ armor save. So on top of it all, they're also a little bit tougher over the regular Aspect Warriors in our index. Okay, so that's Shadow Spectres. Definitely a great unit and probably going to be in a lot of competitive lists, obviously. But again, they are hard to purchase because they are Forge World. Shining Spears are next, and Shining Spears are D tier. Now, I think they're on the upper end of D tier. Maybe, they basically should be either there on the bottom end of C, but they're not good. And the reason being is because they just suffered from the rules nerfs of fly and mounted so hard because they are a combat mounted unit. So on top of having extremely large bases that have trouble fitting through and over ruins and stuff like that, they also have the sad misfortune of being a unit that is an assault unit. So it's really hard to fit them in ruins, really hard to charge enemy units in ruins. They're just an extremely hard unit in general to maneuver around the battlefield. I think their main strength lies in their ability to take out units that have, basically been dumped out of destroyed transports and that are battle shocked. But that's about it, and essentially any combat unit can do the same role for cheaper. So, I don't know. I'm just not a big fan. They are really cool models, though, and they are a new kit. So if you do have Shining Spears, they're definitely awesome. I've just not had much success with them myself against decent opponents that are able to kind of, you know, essentially get around the fact that they're a good combat unit by hiding them behind ruins or just making it generally harder for them to be charged by these guys. Okay, moving on to Shroud Runners. Shroud Runners, S tier. Why S tier? Why weren't they, I've always thought they were really strong. I think they're S tier mostly because of the changes in the meta, right? I mean, you're going to need faster units to be able to score now. Because of the nerfs to Wraithguard and stuff like that, you can't really rely on that stuff. So you do need units that can, kind of secure the board very quickly or, jump around enemy lines and give your other units, again, the ability to wound easier with lethal hits. So giving a unit lethal hits, or giving your whole army lethal hits, I should say, against an enemy target is very powerful. But they also have Scout, which makes them good at disrupting enemy deployment. If, again, just like the Corsair Void Reavers and Void Scarred, right? You can use them to kind of disrupt enemies, have them out in the open. Your opponent thinks they're going to be out in the open. They deploy something of theirs out in the open, and then you just scout behind terrain and you're good. That might not always happen, because obviously sometimes what ends up happening in those situations is your opponent knows you have scout, so just ignores them for the purposes of deployment, but it is a kind of cool trick to have up your sleeve. They're also pretty durable, surprisingly, for 80 points. They have 3 wounds apiece, they have stealth, they have a 5+ invul save against shooting, so they're not exactly super fragile against shooting. They are a fragile unit in general, but they're not super fragile. They're not on the level that, your aspect warriors are at, your swooping hawks and stuff like that. They're a little bit more durable, so therefore they can, kind of take some indirect fire hits. It takes 3 basilisks on average dice to kill them. So because they have that, really sweet spot of 3 models, they're not going to be getting, hit with extra blast attacks. So they are pretty good at that, and because they have 3 wounds, they're just excellent at making basilisks extremely inefficient against them. So definitely an S tier unit, in a lot of different ways. Great at scoring objectives, great at buffing your army and, being able to wound and take out tougher targets. And, of course, they're also fairly durable for the cost. All right, next up we have the Skata Wraith Knight, and the Skata Wraith Knight is going to be B tier. Now, I think this is a recent occurrence. I don't think it was always B tier, but this is a unit that can come in and out of reserve whenever it wants, right? Once per game at least, right? So it's kind of like it has a once per game sky leap. On a unit like this, that's really powerful, especially when you consider you can take things like Inferno cannons on this with really high powered Melta, or Death Shroud cannons, which have really good devastating wounds. I think they have like 3 attacks or 3d6 attacks apiece. So, you're, doing 20 attacks with this thing on average. Very strong. Not that good in combat, this thing, but it's really good at shooting. It is kind of on the expensive side, but, because you can go back in reserve, you can do a lot of different tricks with this thing. So throw Fortune on this thing, throw Guide on this thing, and just watch it go absolutely crazy. Do I think it's the best unit out there? No, but I think it's fun and it's really strong. It has a really strong damage capacity. Okay, Skyweavers. Skyweavers are A tier. They're a great utility unit. Devastating wounds and anti-vehicle is extremely powerful with their haywire cannons. So there's a lot of tough vehicles out there that, again, our army is now going to struggle against, except with things like fire dragons. So unless you have fire dragons with those rerolls to wound out of falcons, you're going to have to struggle against vehicles. But Skyweavers don't care because they have haywire cannons and they're cheap. They're only 95 points for 2 of them. You get 4 shots. On average dice, you're going to be doing 6 to 9 damage against enemy vehicles, which is great. It doesn't matter if they have cover. It doesn't matter if they have, armor of contempt. All that stuff doesn't matter. They're doing 6 to 9 damage. They're very good. They're also a great move blocker, and they're cheap enough to score secondary objectives and sacrifice if needed. So they're a very good utility unit. I think they're probably one of the better Harlequin units. I would actually say that probably maybe the Death Jester and the Solitaire are a little bit, kind of vying for that spot, but these guys are very good as well. And I actually think as the edition goes on and as the meta kind of continues to evolve, you're going to see more of these appearing in lists because, of course, Necrons, a lot of their hardest targets to deal with are vehicles. So, monoliths, doomstalkers, things like that are very difficult because of that 4+ invul save that they have. So I think Skyweavers are going to have a very fun time dealing with those types of units. They also happen to be great against Dark Eldar Venoms. Again, I know I'm, Venom this, Venom that, but I mean, there's a lot of Dark Eldar players going to start playing again because, their new detachment is really good, and these are a great counter to them because, even the bolas are good against Venoms because they wound on 3s, right? So, very good counter against, an army that relies on light transports. Okay, speaking of Harlequins, we have the Solitaire next. The Solitaire, A tier. Definitely A tier. I think with the nerf to Phantasm, unfortunately, guys, I think it's a little bit less viable than before because you could easily just move with Phantasm out of that kind of sweet spot, that lone op range. But now that you can't do that, the Solitaire unfortunately is just tiny bit weaker because of it. And, but I still think it's good. I still think, popping it out of Falcon turn 1, taking out a key target, or using it for secondaries, with the Blitz is very strong. There's a lot of strong plays that you can use with Solitaire. I just think it's a little bit less tricky because of that Phantasm nerf. But it can still do a lot of cool things. And you can always target with Fire and Fade too, and it just moves really fast. And because it's infantry, that means that you can move through ruins. So it can really get to basically anywhere on the battlefield that you need it to go. And again, really good at taking out characters and has really solid damage. Spirit Seer, B tier. And, I think the Fate's Messenger nerf was just a little too much for it. I think it's good, but with also the nerf of Wraithguard as a result, I think it's just not as good. And again, the Fate's Messenger, the cool combo that we, came up with as a community, the Wraith Lord with the twin Bright Lances and the Spirit Seer with Fate's Messenger, it is a dead combination, and it just makes me so sad. I think the Shadow or Spirit Seer is still good. It's not going to be that auto-include in people's lists. You're not going to see it in people's lists a lot anymore because if they're not running Wraithguard, there's really not a great reason to take it unless you're running Wraithblades or something like that. So you might see it in Wraithblade units. I think that's probably a solid pick for Wraithblades, but I just don't think you're going to see it in much else, which again is unfortunate. Okay. The Starweaver. The Starweaver is the Harlequin transport, and I think this is great, and I think you're going to see more of this. And I would say it's an A-tier transport, quite simply. It has a great ability, allows Harlequin units to hop back into it after they've destroyed a target. It has 2 shuriken cannons that has a 4+ invul save, so it's hard to deal with, unlike Venoms, which don't have as much durability. And they're only 80 points apiece. So, I mean, Venoms are now 70 points apiece, so they're a little cheaper. But, having twin shuriken cannons is strong, having the 4+ invul save is strong, and of course, being able to, drop out a unit of Harlequins, they charge something, they kill it, they hop back into it is very powerful as well. So, great transport overall. It's, again, really cheap, and it really benefits a lot from that reroll and wound because it's so cheap, and you can, field a lot of them in your army if you're running Harlequins. Okay. Storm Guardians. Now, I know what you guys are going to say, but S tier. S for Storm Guardian. Why do I think they're S tier? Well, quite frankly, I just really like them. Maybe it's just my playstyle, and maybe it's just my experiences with the unit, but they've always done something valuable for me. And that may not be true of every list, but they are really good at securing your home objective. It's going to be very important to do that now that opponents are bringing things that are very mobile, things that can teleport all around the battlefield, or things that are very fast. It's going to be important to have sticky objectives, and there's not a great source of sticky objectives in the Eldar army. The other thing is they're pretty good at shooting. Their damage is very respectable at close range. 2 flamers, 2 fusion guns is very good, right? Even if it's a Guardian fusion gun, it still does some good damage, and they punch up against a lot of targets that they really shouldn't be punching up against, like Terminators, right? For every 2 fusion guns you have in the unit, you should actually be able to kill 1 Terminator. I know that may not seem like a big deal, but Storm Guardians have no business doing any damage to Terminators, but we already have, 1 dead Terminator from the 2 fusions alone. The pistols and the flamers, they're probably not going to kill another one. They'll maybe get 1 or 2 wounds on it, maybe. But, being able to kill 1 Terminator pretty much reliably is good. Again, sticky objectives as well make them really powerful at, the objective game with a 6-inch advance, either through a command point or a fate dice. They can get to a objective in the midboard. You can throw things like fortune on them. You can be ready with the lightning fast reflexes to throw off your, opponent's math when having to deal with this unit. And it is a rather expendable unit. And just like Guardian Defenders, in the first turn of the game, you can not only make your home objective sticky, but you can spread them out and make it impossible for your opponent to deep strike in your backfield, which can absolutely save you, especially against, again, opponents like Necrons, who are going to be running that Hypercrypt Legion and are going to be deep striking in your backfield. Okay, Storm Guardians are S tier. More reliably, though, and realistically, they're probably closer to A tier. If I'm just being honest and not biased, they're probably an A tier unit. But, they are very good, and I really like them a lot, and I think they fit really well in the meta as well. So, yeah, Storm Guardians are great. Striking Scorpions. Let's go ahead and put those in B tier. I think they're really good. I think the only thing really holding them back, though, is, combat in this edition isn't the greatest. They are, they do have good damage, but when you compare them to something like Hondras, who does it against vehicles, who does his devastating wounds against vehicles and monsters as well, he's doing a lot more damage. I think Striking Scorpions are good, and they're kind of like a good upgrade to Rangers, right? Like, if you do get that first turn with Scorpions, they can do a lot of good things, right? They can kill things like scouts and Space Marine intercessors very easily and prevent your opponent from having cheap scoring units. I think that's very good. They're also very good at tying things up in combat. If you do get first turn, you can tie up vehicles and stuff like that. They can be very powerful at doing that. I think they're probably in between A tier and B tier. I think they're probably closer to A tier. They are a very good unit, and I like them a lot. I think they have a lot of uses in the game as well, and they have new models. So we get to enjoy plastic aspect warriors on the battlefield instead of the metal ones, which is nice. So yeah, definitely a good unit, and I definitely see their usefulness. And also, they can kind of go into Falcon as well, and they can get rerolls to wound. I talked about this in the very beginning of the edition. I said, it might be good to run Scorpions and Falcons, and then I just kind of forgot it after a while, and I kind of used them more myself just as an infiltration unit because a lot of my opponents had other infiltrators, and being able to counter their infiltrators with my infiltrators was something I valued. But they can also very easily be a good damage dealing unit out of a Falcon, rerolling all their wounds against infantry and fishing for those mortals. Or devastating wounds, I should say. Okay, support weapons. Support weapons are A tier. They're solid. The D cannon is really the only A tier option, though. The Vibro cannon is D tier for sure, and the Shadow Weaver is probably a B tier. Or lower, maybe. But, still good in certain circumstances. The D cannon, though, being able to ignore line of sight, deal some significant damage to an enemy heavy behind some terrain, is a very strong ability. So I think because they do a lot of damage, they are going to be an A tier unit, you know? And again, being able to fire out of line of sight with something that is really good against large targets is a very powerful option. But they are fragile. You do need to use them carefully. And I did a recent video on these guys where I talked about it. You do need to watch out for stuff like intercessors. And that's kind of where the Guardian Defenders and Storm Guardians come in, because they can screen those kind of units out so that your D cannon doesn't just get one-shotted. Because they are kind of expensive. They're 125 points apiece, so you do have to be careful with those. Okay, next up, Swooping Hawks. No doubt, S tier. Very fast, can score secondary objectives very easily. They keep your opponent on their toes the entire game. It's really hard to deal with them. And on top of it all, they have decent shooting. Lethal hits with 4 attacks apiece, with strength 4, even if they don't have AP, is pretty good. And considering you can, on occasion, if you really do need to kill something, these guys can just kind of go up on really tall buildings or really tall ruins and get that nice plunging fire. So, they are a very powerful unit in general for objectives, but they do have good damage as well for the cost. They're only 75 points. They're very expendable, and, they will win you games each and every time. Okay, Harlequin Troops. Harlequin Troops are A tier. Now, why do I think they're A tier and Scorpions are B tier? Well, simply put, troops are extremely fast. They have good invul saves, so they're, tough in combat. And with the combination of, units that are now, a lot harder to kill, if you give them the Troop Master, they get devastating wounds. So they have a ton of attacks with devastating wounds against everything, not just against infantry and mounted units or, basically non-vehicles, non-monsters, against everything, which is really strong. So whatever you need to hit, Harlequins can hit it with the Troop Master, and they can be pretty damn effective at it. Now, the only drawback, I think, to the Harlequin Troop is that, again, it is fragile, but I think you're seeing more Harlequin players come out because the meta is shifting toward more, people are bringing more heavy infantry, people are bringing more of those types of units, and Harlequins are now a unit that's pretty solid into those matchups. So I do think they're an A tier. They're probably on the lower end of A tier if I'm not, if I'm being honest, but they are still a very powerful unit for the cost. They're only 75 points. They're pretty cheap. Okay, Troop Master. Got to put them in A tier as well, right? Because that's the combo. So you have these guys coming out of a Falcon, coming out of, Star Weaver or something like that, being able to reroll their wounds. They're doing a lot of devastating wound damage, and they're punching up against a lot of targets as well. So, very strong unit. I think they kind of compete with, against infantry at least. I think the Striking Scorpions are probably the better buy because they're cheaper. But if you're going to want to, if you want some versatility, you want to go against tanks, you want to go against vehicles, and you want to still deal some devastating wounds and also at the same time tie that unit up and make it hard for them to move, I think it's definitely worth it to go with the Troop Master and, of course, the 5 Harlequins combo. So very strong combination there and, can hit pretty hard for the cost. Okay, next up is the Vizark. The Vizark is a C tier unit, so unfortunately the Vizark is still not that good. I don't think giving a unit, an extra character that's already expensive is a good idea, especially if you're running with Harlequins and things like that, Making a big unit of Harlequins even more expensive, even a bigger target, is probably not a good idea. He gives the units fights first. He has precision. He can, give himself devastating wounds and sustained. He's a pretty good fighter, but I just don't think he's worth the cost. I think there's better fighters for the cost. Kahandras is around the same points and does much more damage and is just much better in general. So I think there's just better characters in the Vizark. Yes, he can join your Vrain, but, your Vrain is probably just better off by yourself, right? Especially if you're, running Ynnari, your Vrain is probably either going to want to be by yourself or with a unit of Harlequins, and, there's just not much room for the Vizark in that kind of unit. So, I think he is C tier. He just doesn't quite, I think, hit as hard as he needs to be for the points, and he doesn't quite give his unit enough utility for the points either. But, he's still good, I think. I just don't think he's the best or the most efficient character. Okay, we're on to the Void Weaver. The Void Weaver is A tier. Really good unit. 125 points, has flat damage, so is fate dice independent, and has even a, kind of ability to deal blast, right? Blast damage against infantry targets. So very good, just like kind of like along the same lane as a fire prism. It's kind of like, if you think about it like a mini fire prism, you're not going to be too far off. Again, it lacks the punching power that the fire prism does, but it's cheaper, it has an invul save, and it's very cost effective. It also comes with 2 shuriken cannons, so it is really good at killing infantry and can pick up enemy units fairly easily. They're, units of 5 Space Marines and things like that. It can pick up those units pretty easily. Okay, Viper. Viper is going to be in the B tier as well. Now, Ignores Cover is a great ability, but the Viper is 85 points. It is a little bit expensive for just Ignores Cover, but it's still a useful model to have in a lot of people's armies, especially if you don't like risking your opponent rolling 5s and 6s on saves. So being able to ignore cover means your Bright Lances are going to punch through way harder against enemy targets, and you're going to get a lot less of those feel bad, oh, my opponent rolled 2 6s moments when I really needed him to fail both of those 6-up saves, right? Or, they make at least 1 6 and you're like, oh, well, I guess that unit's going to kill my Warwalker now, right? Vipers can help you with that situation. They also have a Bright Lance, so they're also good at dealing with anti-armor as well. But again, because of the nerfs to fate dice, you might not actually be available to do things like that every single turn. So, basically being able to ignore cover, though, is still, and always will be, a very useful ability to have in your army. So Viper is more of a utility unit. You may want to consider one to ignore cover, and it's especially good with things like fire dragons that want to hit units with 2-up saves, because units with 2-up saves and cover are going to get 5+ saves against melta guns and fusion guns. But with a Viper, they're only going to get a 6-up, so that really increases your chances of being able to kill those heavy targets. So I really do actually like the Viper. I just think it's in a more, kind of utility type of role. It's not as good at dealing damage anymore, so that's probably why I would put it in B tier. Okay, single Warlocks. Let's talk about them. So I actually think single Warlocks are a little bit better than the Conclaves, obviously, so they're still kind of expensive, though. I'd put them in C tier, and the reason I put them in C tier is because I think that there's a lot of other things in the game that do the exact same thing, or in the index, I should say, that do the exact same thing as a Warlock. A Warlock gives a Guardian unit a 6-inch advance. We have a Stratagem, and we have Fate dice that can already do that. Yes, it's more resources, but you're comparing those resources against the points you spend on a Warlock, and oftentimes, 45 points for a Warlock is a little bit steep for that. Second, a Warlock is very squishy. Only has 2 wounds, not very powerful in close combat, has a heavy flamer, which is good, but it's not great for the cost. And I think, honestly, the best way to run these guys is actually as solo operatives just by themselves, because they're actually cheaper than Rangers. So if you just want to use them to move block something important, or you want to tie something up, or you want to just have a flamer out there, or something to score secondary objectives with, I think this is the cheapest option for it, so that might be a good answer. I talked a little bit about them in a past video where I talked about Warlock Skyrunners and single Warlocks being used to kind of plug holes in your battle line. If you need a certain space on the board plugged so people can't deep strike there, they're the cheapest unit that can do it. So I think they do have their uses, but, they're more of a utility unit, and they're not really going to buff Guardians that much. I don't really think you take them to enhance a Guardian unit. But again, that's just my opinion on it. If you do have a different opinion about Warlocks, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear what you guys think about them. I just think they make, Guardian units a little bit too, pricey and a little bit too valuable as a target. So I tend to, if I do take Warlocks on foot, I tend to obviously keep them by themselves. Okay, let's talk about the Conclave. Now, the Warlock Conclave on foot, I think, is C tier, but it's like lower C tier. The reason why is because it does do significant damage. It is a little bit durable, but it's really expensive. It's 120 points for 4 models. That's ridiculous. And the durability is nowhere close to 120 points worth. Their damage is good, but again, nowhere close to 120 points worth. So I think they're just on the cusp of being good. They just need to be cheaper. If Warlocks on foot were 20 points a model instead of 30 points a model, they'd be great. I would be taking those if they were. and they would probably be an A tier or B tier unit, but unfortunately they're just too expensive. They don't trade well, and they're really just for trading, right? So, out of a Falcon, they would be fantastic if I could only, or if I only had to pay 80 points for them, they'd be great. But unfortunately, they're just a little bit too expensive for that. So definitely C tier unit, you know, probably mildly good in some situations, but not definitely not an auto pick for sure. Not anywhere close. Okay, now we have the Warlock Skyrunner just by itself. I would say same thing. I think C tier. I think it's just as it does the same role as a Warlock on foot, with the secondary objectives and stuff. It is a little bit faster than a Warlock on foot, which is good. It still has an assault weapon. Again, that's a very good thing, right? But it is expensive. I think this thing is a lot better with Wind Riders, though. And I think if you're accounting for just Wind Riders and you're running a unit of at least 6 of them, I think you probably want a Warlock in the unit. Not only does it give that unit of 6 an assault weapon for secondary objectives, but it also allows them to ignore cover or get -1 to hit against enemy attacks, which I think is useful. So I think in that scenario, you do want a Warlock Skyrunner. It is useful to also run him, kind of by himself. But, other than those situations, I don't think it has the versatility that maybe some other characters in the Eldar Index do. All right, Warlock Conclaves, I'm just going to say this right now, D tier. They're really expensive. And they're 50 points a model. My god, they're really expensive, and they also you can't take them in a big unit. So not only are they really expensive, but they're not really durable for the cost either. So your Farseer Skyrunner is 100 times, 10 times out of 10 better off with the Phoenix Gem at surviving than he is with a Warlock Skyrunner Conclave. And they really don't do that much damage either. You can only take 2 of them in a unit. You can't take the 4. You can't take a bunch of them. So, just in my opinion, not really worth taking. Okay. So let's talk about this bad boy, the Warp Hunter. I think this is the Warp Hunter. The Warp Hunter. C tier. And probably lower, honestly. Its cheapness, its low cost, makes it a little bit better, but it's still not that great. Its weapon doesn't ignore line of sight. It has a very short range, and it's not even as powerful as something like the Prism Cannon. So it's not as powerful. It has less range. I mean, what's more to there to say? It still needs line of sight. It's just not a very good, not a very good weapon, but it is cheap. It's like kind of like a budget option, but you always have the Falcon for that, right? I think it's the same cost as the Falcon, around the same cost. So, while it's definitely not as terrible as something like, I don't know, the Cobra or the Hemlock Wraithfighter, it's definitely not as good as something like a Fire Prism or Void Weaver or something like that. So, it just kind of falls in that awkward place of not really being able to really hit that hard, and also just not able to really get to the targets it wants to get to. Okay. Next on the list, and we have to scroll down a little bit here, is Warp Spiders. Warp Spiders, S tier. I don't think there's any doubt the Warp Spiders are an S tier unit. They're very good. I think Swooping Hawks have surpassed them in a little bit of ways, because, I think the Phantasm nerf, again, did hit these guys a little bit hard. But the simple fact of the matter is moving 24 inches and being able to overwatch with devastating wounds and auto hits is very strong. It's a very strong board control option to have. And these guys are just good, so I think they're still really good. Phantasm nerf did hit them harder than other aspects, but still a really solid unit for scoring objectives and dealing those last couple wounds on enemy targets as needed. The Wave Serpent, definitely, it's really between A and B. I would say it's probably more along the lines of B tier, just because its ability isn't that strong. It used to be way better in the past. It's just not as strong now. And I think that really kind of, only once per game, D3 wounds and a battle shock test isn't as good as other things in, the game. Also, I mean, you have the Falcon, and it competes with the Falcon for transporting models. Dire Avengers are obviously less strong now, so you're going to see less Dire Avengers, and Wave Serpents were the primary reason why you took a big unit of Dire Avengers, because you were able to protect them with the Wave Serpent. That's no longer really an option, because Dire Avengers aren't as good with that lack of Phantasm. So, you know, overall, what do I think of the Wave Serpent? Good transport. You can definitely transport certain units around the battlefield. It's a fairly effective battle tank, but the units that want to be in a Wave Serpent probably are better off in a Falcon, right? Striking Scorpions, better in a Falcon. Fire Dragons, better in a Falcon. Dark Reapers, even Dark Reapers, which you don't even want in a transport, better in a Falcon, right? You could take them in a Wave Serpent, of course, but I just don't think it's that efficient. And that's kind of where I'm at with the Wave Serpent as far as, the viability of it. I think you probably will see more Wave Serpents here and there, but, you know, I just think you're going to see way more Falcons. I think, if anything, you'll probably see people using Fire Dragons and Wave Serpents just to bring bigger units. Channel commenter mentioned in one of my videos that it might be a good idea to bring Fire Dragons in units of 10. And, I think they're better in Falcons, but I think that's a decent idea. And I think that, especially as the meta continues, we'll maybe see that. We may see people bringing multiple Fire Dragon units to deal with hard targets like monoliths and Satan shards and other, kind of targets that really need the focus of a full 10 unit of Fire Dragons. But we'll see. Okay, next up, the Epic Webway Gate. And of course, it's an S tier unit. No, no, it's not. It's D. It's awful. It's a fortification. No one takes fortifications. They're all useless in the game. Nothing more to say about that. You have to deploy them in your own deployment zone. They barely get any, effects. It just basically counts as another piece of terrain. Who wants to spend 200 points on another piece of terrain on the battlefield? Please. Definitely a D tier unit. Wind Riders. Wind Riders are A tier because they hit extremely hard against mech style targets, and mech style targets are going to be increasing ever more. They also synergize very well with a lot of the other units that are now considered more meta in the Eldar army. Things like Shroud Runners, they synergize extremely well with lethal hits, being able to throw out, 3 shots each with sustained 1. They get full rerolls to hit against enemies on objectives, which is very strong, so they have a built-in guide for themselves. They're just a really good unit. And also, by the way, a lot of people don't realize this, they have 3 attacks at strength 3 in combat. They're not terrible in combat. Actually, you could probably use a unit of 3 of these guys to sweep around a flank, hit a unit of cultists or something weak in the enemy backfield, and then charge in to finish them off, and then, have 4 or 6 OC on your enemy's home objective. So these guys are actually pretty decent at, killing lighter targets as well, even in combat, because they hit on 3+ in combat. If the unit is on an objective, they're getting rerolls to hit. Well, I believe they are. Let me just double check that really quick. That'd be insane. I think it's just shooting, but let's see. Let's double check that, because I think it may be both, which would be awesome. Think about rerolls to hit in combat as well. I'm thinking that's what it is, actually, if I remember correctly. No, it's just range. So it's just range attacks, but that's still pretty good. Hitting on 3+, you do get the reroll from the detachment bonus, so they can definitely take out some cultists or something like that on an objective after they're shooting, right? So they shoot them, soften them up, and then they charge in and finish them off. So and even if they don't finish off the unit, 3 OC on an objective, or excuse me, 6 OC on an objective is going to be hard for a unit of cultists to overcome that's already been whittled down. And also great at scoring secondary objectives. Again, yeah, with the shuriken cannons, they can't advance and score secondary objectives, but they still have movement 14. They're still extremely fast and can definitely get to different places of the board fairly easily with their small base sizes. Okay, let's talk about Wraith Blades. Wraith Blades, I think, are, they're a solid B tier unit now. I think they're up there. I think they are pretty strong in the fact that they can stay on objectives. They are now the toughest unit in the Eldar index as far as being able to survive on objectives, even tougher than the Avatar in a unit of 10 with the Spirits here because they just have so many wounds. So definitely a unit that's very strong on secondaries. The problem, or excuse me, primary objectives. The problem is they're kind of slow, especially with the Phantasm nerf. I don't think you're going to be able to get these guys onto objectives very quickly, but they can advance 6 inches, so you're getting, you are getting enough, movement to move them onto an objective in the first place in the midboard. You just maybe can't transition that easily from one objective to another without spending resources on it. So I do think they're good. I just maybe think they're a little bit too, easy to play around because they are very slow. And of course, you know, even though they're kind of fast for other army standards at movement speed 6, Eldar armies usually move much quicker than that. Okay, Wraith Blades, good option. Next up is, of course, Wraith Guard. I think they're still good, guys. I just think they're B tier now because they are very counterable now. They lost a lot over the last 3 nerfs. They've been nerfed many times, and this last nerf I think really put them into a space where you can still use them. They're still good, but they're just not great. They're not that like go-to unit that will secure you a victory every game because depending on your opponent, you might actually just be completely outclassed. So what changed? Well, they can't really phantasm that effectively anymore, so they can't, kind of get away from enemy assaults as easily, so opponents can obviously assault them in. They can't also be extra aggressive with Phantasm to get up the board quickly so that they can shoot at enemy units. And on top of that, their ability now has to target the enemy unit that targeted them. So it's kind of a retaliatory strike, which isn't as powerful as just obviously being able to shoot at anything you want. So they're not that great at controlling the board anymore either. And lastly, the Fate's Messenger nerf makes it so they can't just auto proc those devastating wounds every time they shoot, right? So that is unfortunate as well. So I think they lost a lot there. I think Wraith Blades are probably more cost effective for just surviving on objectives. And I think Wraith Guard are going to be primarily just a, kind of harder to kill damage dealing unit. But, again, taking them in a unit of 10, I think you can still do it, but it's going to be a lot harder to actually use the unit effectively. Okay, let's talk about the nerfed Wraith Knight. I think the nerfed Wraith Knight is probably still C tier. I think it's better obviously now because you do have units that have gotten comparatively more expensive, but I still think it's kind of on the lower end. The reason being is it doesn't ignore line of sight anymore. You can't use Overwatch with it and stuff like that, and I think it doesn't have a whole lot of mobility, so it's going to be hard to actually be able to shoot things with it. Unlike the Skatar Wraith Knight that can, hop out of reserves, via deep strike and stuff like that. The Wraith Knight doesn't have that option. It has to deploy on the board. And, realistically, it's just, I just don't think it gets the job done for the points. Now, if you were to take a Wraith Knight, I think it's definitely possible. It's one of the things that, can actually do decently well against a Satan Shard or Monolith or stuff like that. But for the points that you pay, it is very expensive, and there's going to be some matchups where it just dies. Right? I mean, being able to be seen by everything on the battlefield is something that, has to be addressed as well, because it can be shot at fairly easily. Okay. Wraith Knight. Now we have Wraith Lord. Wraith Lord, B tier. Now, I would put it in A tier, but I have found that a lot of the strengths actually came from Fate's Messenger. I think the Fate's Messenger combo being nerfed so bad really hurt the Wraith Lord's viability, but I still think the Wraith Lord is really good. It does generate Fate dice, so if you equip it with things other than Bright Lances, it has a reasonably good chance of finishing off targets, like Space Marine units and stuff, with Shuriken Cannons, or, if you want to give it Star Cannons or something like that, I think that's a decent, pick as well. It's just, you probably don't want to have a Spirit Seer with it anymore for anything serious, just because of the fact that, with the fact that it has to be up close and personal now, without that Fate's Messenger, it's a little bit less durable. Giving it all those keywords, those anti-infantry weapons are going to be good against it, anti-character weapons are going to be good against it, and it's not durable enough to withstand those kind of attacks, so I don't think you do that, right? I think you run it solo. It's a great unit to kind of counterpunch things. It's a great unit to stand on an objective, not in the early game, but in the later stages of the game after it's done, kind of, it's a really good unit to hold the weak side of a battlefield off from enemy units. So I think it's good, just not at the level of, A tier and S tier units, but it's still fairly effective, and I do like Wraith Lords a whole lot. I think as the meta kind of evolves, we'll see how they turn out. I think its biggest drawback, though, that keeps it from being better, obviously, and same thing with Wraithguard and Wraithblades, is the innate 4+ to hit really does harm it. In a lot of ways, you don't want to attach a Spirit Seer, but you're kind of torn between wanting to hit better and do more damage with the Spirit Seer and keeping it cheap and keeping it cost effective, which oftentimes it ends up losing in either one of those arenas. Okay, next up we have the Wraith Seer. Wraith Seer, I think, is just on the same level as the Wraith Lord. I think pretty good. It does cause battle shock tests, which isn't great, but if you have a lot of units that from your opponent's army that rely on stratagems to be effective, this could be a good pick. It also has precision on its weapons, so that's nice as well. Now, the thing about the Wraith Seer, though, again, is just like the Wraith Knight, it hits on 4+. So you kind of almost need a Spirit Seer with it, and that can be a little challenging. Now, it does have the Psyker keyword as well. So, even if you run it alone, it still has that, anti-Psyker tools are very good against it. So, especially with the Spirit Seer, now it's going to be anti-Psyker, anti-infantry, and anti-character weapons are all going to be more effective against it. And the Wraith Seer is more of a midfield bully unit. And because of that, it's going to be in the line of fire a lot. So you do have to think about that. And that 5+ invul save, it seems good, but when you have a 2+ armor save and you're in cover, it really doesn't come up as often as you would think. Okay. Let's talk about the Yin-Karn, because the Yin-Karn, I think, is still an A tier unit. I don't think it's S tier anymore, because, not being able to teleport everywhere you want as much as you want is obviously a pretty sizable nerf, but it can still get to its target. You destroy an enemy unit, it can still transport to that unit, and it can charge something. So they didn't get rid of that combo. They don't prevent it from charging after it teleports, which is still extremely strong and I think pretty good. So I think, obviously the Yin-Karn is still good, but it's just not as versatile and not as tricky as it once was. Okay, Prince Riel. I think Prince Riel's B tier. Now, the reason I think this is because they recently clarified that units that redeploy can use special abilities like Infiltrate. So I think it might be worth it to include Prince Riel in some lists now if you have a lot of Striking Scorpions and Rangers and things like that, because you could just move them back into Strategic Reserve, or you could redeploy them and they could still use their Infiltrate ability. So, if you have a bad feeling that maybe you're going to go second, or go second instead of first, you don't want to risk your Striking Scorpions, but you wanted to screen out enemy infiltrators, you can bring those Striking Scorpions into reserve, or you can bring them back into your deployment zone, or you can bring them kind of wherever they want to on the battlefield. Because of that rule change, they don't just have to be in your deployment zone or reserve. They can use their infiltration ability. So I think that's really strong. I think that's good. And other than that, he's decent in combat. He's not super effective in combat, but he's decent. And, being able to redeploy units is always something that can be very useful. Okay. Last unit on the list is Yvraine, and Yvraine is A tier. Now, I want to make a quick announcement. I actually recently got a pro-painted figure from a Patreon of the channel, member of the channel. His name's Toys for the Toy God, and you can check him out on Instagram. Very good painter. He recently painted a Yvraine model up for me and sent it to me, and it looks amazing. It's the best painted model I've ever had the pleasure of owning, and it's just absolutely gorgeous. And I want to show you guys eventually. I'm going to do a video pretty soon We're going to have a community painting contest. And I think it's time, guys. I think, when I saw that model, I was like, it's time to show off the community skills, because the community has some amazing painting skills. I'm not the best painter out there. I think I'm, probably on the basic level of painting, but that's about it. And I just think there's some amazing painting, amazing people that just paint really well out there, and then I want to show them off to the community. So we're going to do a, kind of community painting contest pretty soon. Stay tuned for a video about that probably later next week. Okay, anyway, back to your Vrain. Your Vrain's awesome. First of all, I think Ynnari are probably going to be super strong in the meta coming forward. MSU is back. Reavers are really good. A lot of the Dark Eldar units are very strong now for the points. And because Ynnari can kind of pick and choose from the best of both worlds, they're going to be, I think, in a great position to be strong. Yvrain is obviously a character you have to take with them, but she's not really attacked because she has really good anti-infantry killing power. She has anti-infantry 2+ and devastating wounds. She is just taking out infantry left and right. She can remove anything she wants to in infantry, of infantry on the battlefield. She's really good anti-Terminator. She could just rip through Terminators with devastating wounds. It's really insane. So, she is really good. And then, of course, in combat, she also has devastating wounds as well with her combat weapon. So she's really cool. And then, she gives bonuses to the unit she's with. If she does join a unit, like a unit of Harlequins, she gives them Feel No Pain 5+. She also gives them the ability to resurrect. So not only do they have Feel No Pain 5+, but they also can resurrect D3 models in her command phase, which is cool, I think she's a really good model. Competitively speaking, I think she's probably better off in either one or two configurations, a big unit of Harlequins or by yourself. I don't think there's any real in between because you're not getting the most out of her either way. But, she does have deep strike as well. So she can kind of like deep strike in and like kill something on the enemy backfield if they're not paying attention. And she can also, if she's with the Harlequins, of course, she can also hit very hard with them and really just do a number on enemy units. So really good model. And really great way to end this tier video. So this is it. That's all the Eldar units in the Eldar, both, Imperial Armor and Index. I don't think I'm missing anything, but let me know if I did, because I just did this off of Tier Maker. So, if there's a unit missing here that I'm, not thinking of, let me know. But I don't think so. I think we got all of them. It's a massive amount of units that the Eldar have, and I'm looking forward to seeing where the Eldar are in competitive play. But I'm just myself having a lot of fun playing the Eldar, especially after the nerfs. It is a little bit trickier. It's more challenging, but we're having to lean into more of our aspect warrior units. And as you can tell, some of the top dogs of competitive play right now are aspect warriors, fire dragons, shadow specters, hawks, spiders, right? And then we have, of course, the, Giga Chad Storm Guardian unit, which is awesome, right, as well, and also Fuegan. And we just have a bunch of cool units that, some of them were being used before, but some of them are new. And it's always good to try out new things and, kind of see where, units are competitively and how they adapt to new changes. So I really like that a lot, and I'm looking forward to getting more games. I actually have a game coming up against my Necron buddy this weekend, and what I'm thinking is he's going to bring a more kind of competitive list to what he usually brings. He's going to be using some proxies because I asked him if he would be willing to run Hypercrypt Legion instead of his normal, kind of Silver Tide and Necron Warrior list that he always runs, edition after edition. But he said he would do it, and this I think will give me some good experience against Necrons, and I'll be able to kind of tell you guys what I think more in depth about the Necron matchup. A little bit more than just watching a game with two players. It's going to be a little bit more involved in that. I'm actually going to be, kind of using some of the strategies that I've talked to you guys about on paper for dealing with things like Satans and Necron monoliths and stuff like that. He is running a double monolith, double Satan list, so we'll just kind of have to see where that goes. I don't know if I'll have the tools to deal with all those tough units. But my game plan going into it is that I'm going to go into it wanting to, try to clear out the immortals that he has in his army. He has quite a few immortals in his army. I'm going to clear out those types of units, and I'm going to force him to use the Satans to do secondary objectives and stuff like that. And I think I can beat him on that secondary objective game. And I'm going to use Storm Guardians. I hope they survive, because if he's a smart player, they won't. Well, he is a smart player, but if he's going to be smart in the game, he's going to take out the Storm Guardians first. But if they don't get taken out and they make some objectives sticky, I'm going to make it really hard for him to deep strike near those objectives. It's going to be really hard for him to get to. So that's the goal anyway. We'll see if that ends up panning out, and I'll probably do a video down the road about how that battle went. Okay, anyway, that's going to be for today. Thanks for watching, guys. I will see you guys next time. Let me know what your thoughts are about this tier list. I know there's a couple of oddballs here and there, but that's just kind of my personality, I think. Is just, seeing things in units that, kind of may not seem super competitive, but that have worked really well in weird ways for me, and that I can kind of, see for myself. But we'll just kind of have to wait and see how the meta shakes out and what units are actually, being used. So anyway, see you guys later. See you guys next time. And just a couple more announcements before we end the video. I do have a channel Patreon if you want to help support the channel. I do have free trials activated on that. So, when you join, you get to join for free, and that will give you access to the Discord community we have. And we've really been growing the community. It's really awesome to participate in it. I'm available in it most of the time to talk. If you want to talk strategy or Eldar tactics or whatever, I'm there usually to talk about it. And a lot of other members of the community are too. And it's a really helpful environment. And yeah, it's great for both veterans and new players of the game. So if you want to come join, I will leave the link for that in the description. And I'm also a Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page as well. So if you guys want to, support that way, you can as well, and I will leave the links in the description. All right, everybody, that's going to be for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.